Hey, it's Mrs. Baranyk, and this is the fifth video in my series covering world history before 1200. We're in the classical era now, a time of empires, the growth of world religions, and the intensification of trade. In the last video, I talked about the model for most great empires, the Persians. Today, we'll move on to the Greeks. When most of us think of ancient Greece, we think about the city of Athens and its ancient ruins that so many important American buildings are modeled after. Just look at that big building in the middle of the picture, the Parthenon, and you can see how it influenced our Supreme Court or famous museums like the Chicago Field Museum. A huge part of this, of course, is because Greece was the birthplace of democracy and the home of the first museum, although it was more like a university. Now, when I say democracy, I mean democracy that didn't include the voices of women or enslaved people or people whose parents weren't both born in Athens. So, like democracy where 10 to 20% of the population actually had a voice. But hey, it's a start, right? Anyway, Greek history is actually older than those buildings. We could take it all the way back to an ancient group called the Mycenaeans, but for the sake of time, we're going to start after the Greek Dark Ages. Greece didn't start out as an empire. It was a series of city-states thanks to the mountainous terrain that kept people separated. The city-states had different forms of government and different cultures. Usually, people like to contrast Sparta and Athens. The Spartans were a military society. Like from the age of 7, every boy went to live in the military barracks. And this was mostly because they had conquered and enslaved their neighbors, and they were terrified of them rising up to take back their freedom, which they almost did once. Even girls got some military training. But this left very little space for personal expression and the arts. Then there was Athens, where at age 7, all boys started school where they got an education, much like yours. But notice I didn't say girls. This was a super patriarchal society, and for girls the only option was to be a wife or mother. Very little else was open to them. But boys could become artists, playwrights, statesmen, philosophers, whatever they wanted. They all got military training too, but it wasn't the center of their lives. One of the big things that defined Greek history was its war with the Persians. It's a long and exciting story, but you're going to have to look that one up on your own. Suffice to say that the Greek city-states eventually worked together and held off the Persians, who ultimately decided that the Greeks weren't worth their time. But after feeling like they had had this huge win against the mighty Persian Empire, the Greek city-states entered their golden age. This was mostly focused around Athens, and this is when those awesome buildings went up, and the philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle wrote works about politics, science, and the nature of man that inspire us to this day. But eventually the city-states turned on each other, weakening all of them, until their militaristic neighbors to the north, the Macedonians, who incidentally considered themselves Greeks, which is funny because the Greeks saw them as barbarians, came and conquered the Greek city-states under Philip II and Alexander the Great. This was when Greece became an empire. The city-states were ruled together, and then when Alexander went on to conquer the Persians as well. A huge Greek empire was created, but it was very short-lived. Alexander died very young, and an empire that size that was fairly newly conquered just couldn't survive. It broke up into several competing empires, including the Ptolemies, which was the famous Cleopatra's family in Egypt. What's important is that Greek soldiers settled down in these formerly Persian lands, and Greek culture spread into them. Now, it wasn't like they became super Greek, but Persian culture blended with Greek culture. Even in northern India, you see elements of Greek culture. Generally, we call this Hellenistic culture. And a form of the Greek language, Koine, was spoken by scholars throughout these lands who could communicate and spread knowledge. Once Greece was conquered by the enormous Roman Empire, its cultural legacy was ensured, as the Romans adopted many aspects of Greek culture. And I'll talk about the Romans in video 6.